I'd like to call the Administration and Finance Committee to order. Roll call, please.
Dr. Gopi. Dr. Gopi is not present. Mr. Castillo?
Here.
Mr. Castillo is present. Dr. Davis?
Here.
Dr. Davis is present. Ms. Ellis?
Here.
Ms. Ellis is present. Mr. Garvey?
Here.
Mr. Garvey is present. Ms. Holloway?
Here.
Ms. Holloway is present. Mr. Mellery?
Here.
Mr. Mellery is present. Mr. Morris?
Here.
Mr. Morris is present. Ms. Morris Jones?
Present.
Ms. Morris Jones is present. Mr. Rock? Mr. Rock is present. And Ms. Loche?
Here.
Ms. Loche is present. You have a quorum.
Thank you. First item, please.
Your consent agenda is ready for approval, adding items 5.1, 5.2, 6.1, and 7.1.
May I have a motion, please? Moved by Mr. Rock, second by Mr. Garvey. Any discussion? Any objection to the motion? Hearing none, motion passes. Next item, please.
Your first item is on page 22, item 4.1, consideration of an update report regarding school systems and schools in non-compliance with the 70% instructional requirement for fiscal year 2019-2020. The recommendation is to receive the report.
May I have a motion to receive? Motion by Mr. Morris, second by Mr. Garvey. Any questions? Any objection to the motion? Hearing none, motion passes. Next item, please.
On page 62, item 5.3, consideration of the fiscal dialogue as a result of the fiscal risk assessment process for fiscal year 2020 and 2021. The recommendation is to receive.
I need a motion to receive. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Rock, second by Mr. Castile. Is there any report or just a motion to receive? All right, any questions? Any objection to the motion? Hearing none, motion passes. Next item.
On page 69, item 5.4, consideration of LDE and RSD contracts of $50,000 and over. The recommendation is to approve.
May I have a motion to approve, please?
Superintendent Bochet, one comment after your motion.
Motion by Mr. Morris, second by Mr. Rock. Superintendent?
Yes, Madam Superintendent Bochet, appreciate the opportunity to offer some commentary here. There's a particular contract on this selection or listing of contracts that has received a good bit of attention from this board that has prompted additional attention in the public. And what I would like to do, if acceptable to you, Superintendent Bochet, is just allow our Chief of Staff, Dr. Timmel, to speak to that particular contract, which does involve a consultant around the Louisiana Comeback Plan. Dr. Timmel.
Thank you, Superintendent Bochet, committee members, and Superintendent Brumley for the opportunity to address the misappropriation of fund allegation with LDOE's contract procedures and the issuance and execution of LDOE's emergency contract with Invicta Consulting. Before I address that, I do again want to acknowledge the very important work of our Louisiana educators on behalf of more than 700,000 students who call Louisiana home. In the face of enormous challenges, numerous obstacles over the past year and a half, our Louisiana educators and system leaders rose to the challenge and the occasion of swiftly completing student-centered, thoughtful, priority-aligned academic recovery and acceleration plans. These plans detail how school systems are making investments to prioritize the well-being and academic recovery of our students and our educators. It is my belief, as evidenced by our educators' actions throughout these unprecedented times, our students will return, they will be well, they will recover academically, our educators will expand in their literacy content pedagogy and implementation of best practices, and we will keep our students and educators safe by all means. Next, I want to acknowledge and thank Dr. Rutledge, Invicta CEO, and the Louisiana educators who are reviewing, providing feedback on the academic recovery acceleration plans. We know the task is rigorous, complex, and occurring within a condensed timeline. This work is continuous and ongoing. As I have received frequent updates on the progress, there has been an average of 5 to 6 30-minute one-to-one school system support calls a day. That's approximately 30 calls a week. There's been an average of 45 minutes spent per plan, synthesizing, analyzing, collecting, deliberating, and preparing feedback before plans move to a second review phase, within the second review phase, and then on to LDOE for final approval and publication. Dr. Rutledge is present in the audience today. I want to acknowledge publicly her leadership, the spirit of service, excellence, and professionalism demonstrated throughout this process. In addition, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the Federal Support and Grantee Relations Division, who continually collaborate, coordinate, and support this process as a partner with Invicta. As we mentioned earlier, there are 191 submitted academic recovery and acceleration plans, a total of 71 approved, a total of 56 published, and the remaining 120 plans are in the second review phase. It is our goal to have all approved plans published on the Louisiana Comeback website and on LDOE's website by the end of the month. Again, to all of our reviewers and internal team members involved in this process, thank you for prioritizing your commitment to our students and educators. As presented during the previous committee, the requirement for our school systems to submit plans that are to be reviewed and approved by LDOE on an abbreviated timeline was a monumental task for our school system leaders and also for us as recipients and stewards of these funds. We moved with urgency to ensure our students and educators received access to high-quality in-person learning experiences this school year. However, as educators, we understand that this urgency was not only necessitated by federal and state requirements, but we as educators leading this agency, we have a moral imperative, a fiscal responsibility, and a commitment to our stakeholders to ensure the use of these funds demonstrate, as we've mentioned before, collective impact, strategic budgeting and planning, and transparency at the LEA and the SEA level. We've all said this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reimagine education, to address achievement gaps, and close opportunity gaps without money causing a barrier. Therefore, we are keenly aware that the management of ESSER funds will come with scrutiny, also stakeholder interest and recommendations and expectations to evaluate and measure student outcomes as a result of these dollars. Yet we remain ready and steady as servant leaders who support all stakeholders to ensure all students have what they need to succeed. Now, I want to address the serious questions raised regarding the origins and merits of LDOE's emergency contract procedures, and specifically the Invicta Consulting contract. I will provide a series of facts to address the perceived optics. Fact 1. All contracts presented to the board have been unanimously approved and endorsed. All contracts have followed the Louisiana Procurement Code, the Louisiana Public Bid Law, or respective no bid or emergency provision. The agency has issued and executed 40 emergency-related contracts, all of which have been approved or endorsed by BESE. The procedure of initiating and executing emergency contracts since March 2020, which was the start of the governor's emergency proclamation, has not changed or wavered from the last administration to this administration. On June 15, 2021, during the Admin and Finance Committee meeting, agenda item 2.3, titled Consideration of LDE Emergency Contracts Approved by the State Superintendent of Education, was presented for ratification. This agenda item included 12 emergency contracts over $50K. These contracts were unanimously ratified. When contract process questions occurred, we sought legal counsel, guidance from our internal contract team, which we would consider as subject matter experts, and conferred with BESE's executive director as necessary or requested. On Friday, November 5th, I spoke with President Holloway to make her aware of media inquiries regarding the Invicta contract, to which she explained the BESE process by which decisions on contracts are made. On Tuesday, November 9th, I reached out to each BESE member to clarify, explain, or answer questions about LDOE's contract procedures, and specifically the Invicta contract, as an article was printed. By Wednesday, November 10th, I spoke with each board member, with the exception of the BESE officers. An additional fact, on November 9th, a $60,000 payment was issued to Invicta in accordance with the contract scope of work and deliverables rendered 10/31/21. Fact, a written statement provided by LDOE's Administrative Program Director of Contracts and Procurement on November 10th reads, the purpose of processing contracts without OSP or BESE approval was to accomplish services and payments on an emergency basis. After an emergency contract is processed through LaGov, OSP, that's the Office of State Procurement, requires the entire contract package to be attached to complete the record. After this, the items are prepared for the BESE agenda. When approved, we then secure the BESE stamp, i.e. the signature. This is the standard operating procedure established March 2020 and followed consistently today. There has been no deviation in the process. All steps in processing contracts were followed. Just the order of the steps are revised to accommodate the emergency proclamations issued by the governor. I'll share additional facts regarding Invicta CEO, Dr. Charmaine Rutledge, to address perceptions of cronyism. Fact, Dr. Charmaine Rutledge has more than 17 years of experience as an educator. She has been a teacher, a school leader, and a school system leader in East Baton Rouge Parish School System. She is a subject matter expert in curriculum, instruction, assessment, technology integration, and she has a high-capacity technological skill set. She is a professional developer, a coach, and a mentor to school and district leaders. And she was very instrumental in the successful outcomes of EDR's Innovation Network. During my tenure as EDR's Assistant Superintendent, I was Dr. Rutledge's supervisor. She had excellent evaluation ratings with minimum refinements needed. Lastly, she has an extensive access to a network of educators throughout the state. As she is a graduate of LSU, the Louisiana Superintendent's Academy, and she serves on various education and community-wide committees. In retrospect, I understand the perceived optics. However, at the time, optics were not top of mind. In collaboration with every assistant superintendent at the agency, we were immersed in defining, guiding, articulating, and supporting educators through an unfamiliar set of federal requirements, state laws, and agency expectations within an abbreviated timeline. In the previous committee, a timeline was presented that demonstrated our responsibility to support school systems with meeting federal requirements, state laws, and LDOE commitments. We worked countless hours, not only engaging with stakeholders, answering many questions, answering many calls, but also internally aligning multiple reporting requirements into a single comprehensive process, the Academic Recovery and Acceleration Plan. This plan, along with aligned achieved budgets in EGMS, articulate each school system's actions for addressing the mental health and academic needs of our students, particularly those disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. With all the funds that flow out to school systems, there are internal processes and controls implemented by the agency's fiscal arm to make those dollars available, ensuring compliance with local, state, and federal law, rules, and regulations. I'll give you a high-level overview of managing these funds. It first starts with receiving funds through a grant award notification, also known as a grant. Creating codes to track the funds. We learned about that earlier, the EIC or audit codes. Determining the splits, what stays with the state, what flows out. Calculating allocations to determine the amount each LEA receives. Creating budget applications in EGMS, which includes developing in consideration questions, allowable use of funds, and assurances of these funds. Then once an actual budget application is created and built, allocations are loaded, we communicate with school systems and support them through completing budgets. We review budgets in EGMS. We approve budgets in EGMS, both fiscally and programmatically, all while managing a help desk that has the potential to receive more than 190 individual LEA questions. While it takes collaboration and coordination of multiple teams, most of this process is largely executed by our grants management team. It's a small team. In just over a year, LDOE received more than $4 billion, of which ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 were awarded in a 3-month period. The responsibility to get these dollars out requires the same process of preparation, creation, reviews, and approvals as all other existing funds managed by this unit. Yet, no additional positions were added to support the increased workload associated with the achieved budget applications. Furthermore, the Academic Recovery and Acceleration Plans were in addition to the achieved budgets in EGMS. This team is also responsible for collecting, reviewing, approving more than 190 written applications. Again, no additional positions were added to support this increased workload. We thoroughly assessed and determined our internal team's capacity as a non-option. Also, top of mind was the truncated timeline by which this work needed to be done. The FSGR team, Deputy Chief of Staff, and I met to determine our needs, scope of work, and potential solutions to start this work as quickly as possible. We identified critical criteria. We knew that we needed experience, managing a thorough and complex review process, including training and quality assurance of reviewers, capacity to accomplish the task of reviewing, providing one-to-one support for more than 190 applications, educational expertise as a teacher, a school leader, and a system-level leader, including an authentic appreciation for the importance of this work, was also very important to us. And then also we knew that we needed reviewers who would have a deep understanding of the Louisiana landscape with firsthand knowledge of the unique challenges and strengths of our educators and students. No other state has faced many crises as we have in the midst of a global pandemic. So it was important that our partners created and operated with empathy and without compromising the excellence we've come to appreciate. Several options were considered in this process. Could we amend an existing contract with a partner to do this work? Could we delegate the reviewer responsibilities to in-house staff, agency-wide? We even considered Dr. Chason and I would be the leaders of that process, but that was quickly negated. Could we contract with a partner to manage a review process while we manage multiple individual reviewer contracts? Could we contract with a partner to manage the entire review process, including getting a team of qualified reviewers? In our deliberations with the team primarily responsible for this work, we determined our school systems would be best served if we outsourced to a partner who met the criteria and who could begin work immediately. As such, we considered 3 partners: Poster Wade and Netterfield, Invicta, and Attuned. Our federal support and grantee relations team has an existing contract with Poster Wade and Netterfield to support the Year Eames application for our non-publics. Our operational quality team was in the process of a contract with Invicta to support the school system planning process. Our school system relations team had an existing contract with Attuned to support the Strong School Systems initiative. We put all of these partners next to the criteria I discussed earlier and determined that we could pursue conversations with PNN and Invicta based on the criteria and options we had deliberated. We determined that the Executive Director of Federal Support and Grantee Relations would reach out to PNN, and our Deputy Chief of Staff would reach out to Invicta. Once each team member reached out to our vendors to get a clearer understanding of their capacity and ability to execute the work as a team, we decided Invicta met the aforementioned criteria and would be the best option for our students. Next, we determined the scope of work and deliverables. This states that the contractor will design, implement, and manage a comprehensive review process for plans submitted by approximately 191 LEAs. Identify, train, support, and manage a team of external reviewers based on a set of criteria developed in partnership and collaboration with LDOE. Set up a review process and structure in collaboration with LDOE. And design a process such that there's a primary reviewer for each LEA plan submitted. The primary reviewer, and in one case it is the Department of Education, is the LEA point of contact for revisions, questions, and clarifications. Each plan is reviewed by at least 2 reviewers. Reviewers' notes are consistent and understandable for LEAs to submit revisions, and that LDOE would be provided with updates on the number of reviews completed, the number of reviews in progress, number of reviews not yet started, general updates on any other pertinent information, complete an initial review of every application within 10 business days of submission. And then also coordinate with the LDOE contact for a timeline and method for sharing the academic recovery plans as we needed to negotiate plans going into EGMS and then publish. and then complete all reviews by December 31st, 2020. The Fiscal Relations Grantee Support Team immediately began processing the contract. Again, time was of the essence. As stated in the scope of work, the team and I collaboratively provided Invicta with various resources in support, such as materials that contain state and federal laws and requirements, the Academic Recovery and Acceleration Plan and Guidance document, examples of reviewer criteria, a list of educators as potential reviewers, LDOE branded letters with example content. As a provision of the Governor's Emergency COVID-19 Public Health Emergency Proclamation, the contract was issued and executed in response to the impact of COVID-19. The contract began on September 13th and will end on December 31st. Citing reasonable cause that warrants an investigation, it was requested that Legislative Auditor Michael Wagasback investigate emergency contracts issued by the State Department of Education. As did we. We also requested that the legislative auditors who were conducting an internal audit expand their current audit to include LDOE emergency contracting procedures. Currently, LDOE staff has begun meeting with legislative auditors, and we are working to provide any requested documentation. As we stated earlier, transparency and responsibility are two core values that shape the way we operate and conduct our business. We have been faithful stewards of public funds and have worked with an urgency to support our educators as they meet the needs of students, families, and communities. A continuous improvement process drives every facet of our internal operations. If there's a way for us to be better, we will find it and we will implement it. I've always been taught to seek the root cause of an issue before applying a solution. It is my personal and professional conviction to work together to resolve and reconcile the alleged and implied lingering questions directed at this administration. I believe Louisiana's future is bright, and together Louisiana students will achieve when we put our students first and work towards a common goal. At this time, I will answer any questions you have for me.
Thank you, Dr. Timmer. Do board members have any questions? Mr. Garvey.
Before we get to the questions and log up all of these other contracts that are waiting for approval, I would make a motion that we separate this contract from the rest of them that are in this agenda item, and not include the emergence one, too, and suggest that we approve the other ones first, so we can address this one and the emergent contract.
All right, is that in a motion? Sorry. So the motion, from what I understand, is to pull the emerging contract, the evicted contract, and you are, so do we have a second to that?
To approve the rest of the
To
contract.
approve the rest, all right. Do we have a second to that motion?
I have an amendment.
Okay, first, do we have a second? Mr. Mellering, a request amendment?
Yes,
Mr. Steele?
I'd also ask, to the extent that we follow the same process, I heard Dr. Timmel reference the Postal Wade Netterville contract. If we're going to defer and have questions, I'd like to add the PNN contract as well to be discussed separately.
Do you have an objection to that amendment, Mr.
No, ma'am.
Mr. Mellering? No. So the motion is to pull those three contracts and to move approval of the rest of the contracts listed. All right, and the people who wish to give public comment, I'm going to assume I have two, Mr. Sexton and Mr. Romer. Your comments will be in relation to the contracts we're pulling, is that correct? Okay. So any then further discussion about the existing contracts other than those three, which we're moving to approve now?
Well, I have questions, and I think they apply to all of them. So I have questions.
Go ahead.
So I want to get into the process, and frankly it applies to not only those that are being deferred, but the entire set of contracts. So, Ms. Hunt, if you don't mind coming to the table, and Mr. Rondo, if you don't mind coming to the table as well, we've got a few follow-up questions. So let me start off, and Ms. Hunt, let me ask you, if you don't mind. I'm going to start off with the PNN contract, because I think it applies broadly to all the contracts that we're being asked to consider. When I look at the PNN contract that's on page 93 of our packet, tell me the process for which this particular contract was pursued.
I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that question. Do you mean as far as it being an emergency contract?
Was it an emergency contract? Yes.
Was it an emergency contract?
Yes, this contract is actually an amendment to a contract that was originally an emergency contract, so this is an amendment.
Okay, but it was approved on a similar emergency basis as the other contracts that are being considered
Yes,
under the governor's proclamation?
yes,
So this contract, I understand with the amendment that the total contracted amount that we're being asked to approve is $4,750,000. Is that correct?
so the,
I see it on page 93, and it appears that that's the amount. So the previous amount, 1.9 million, new contract 2.8, total contract amount 4.7. Ms. Hunt, there's a lot of discussion about what we should be doing procedurally or not doing procedurally. My understanding, I think we all know that you're counsel for the Department of Education, correct?
Correct.
All right, so in terms of this process, you advise not only the Department of Education, but by extension us, as it relates to the proper procedure for approving these contracts in excess of $50,000. Do you have any concerns about the process that was identified by Dr. Timmel as being the standard operating procedure that was approved and established on March 20th, 2020?
No, I don't. Under revised statute 29724A, the governor has the authority to issue executive orders, proclamations, and regulations, and those executive orders, proclamations, and regulations have the force and effect of law. And they can suspend laws. And that's also true under 29766 when there's a health emergency. The governor can suspend the provisions of any regulatory statute prescribing procedures for the conducting of state business or the orders.
Just have you put your microphone closer to you, just a little bit.
Can suspend the provisions of any regulatory statute prescribing procedures for conducting of state business or the orders, rules, and regulations of any state agency if strict compliance with the provisions of any statute, order, rule, or regulation would in any way prevent, hinder, or delay necessary action in coping with the emergency. And so the two, beginning, there were some, state procurement has been suspended in each of the regulatory proclamations since the beginning of the public health emergency. There was a slightly different language in some of the earlier emergencies, but from May 2020 to date, the language has been the same. The two I pulled were 168 JBE 2021 and 182 JBE 2021, because those are the two that were effective in September and October when this contract was signed. And they both say, pursuant to 17724, which I just read, suspensions of the Louisiana Procurement Code and Louisiana Public Bid Law and corresponding rules and regulations are hereby continued for the purpose of the procurement of any goods and service necessary to respond to this emergency, including emergency contracts, cooperative endeavor agreements, and any other emergency amendments to existing contracts, which we did have a closer look at as well.
Okay, so And do you believe or have any information that suggests in any way that the department has not followed that process in presenting these contracts to this board for approval?
I believe the department has followed the emergency procedures, yes.
How many contracts, again, have we approved so far under this particular process that apparently somebody has approved for us to follow?
40,
40 contracts to date that we've already approved using this process.
using the emergency.
Okay. So, Ms. Davis, would you mind coming to the table as well?
So I'll ask, are these being presented as ratified, this emergency contract that you're presenting, the Invicta and the other one? Are these being presented as ratified like the ones in June, or are these just approved?
No, I'm sorry, I still had some more questions.
Okay.
I want to follow.
But I want to clarify.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So, Mr. Rongo, you're counsel for BESE, correct?
Yes.
And you give advice and counsel to us in terms of legally what we should or shouldn't do, correct?
Correct.
All right, so you've heard the testimony, if you will, of Ms. Hunt in terms of her explanation. The 40 contracts that this board has approved based on the process outlined by Dr. Timmel and Attorney Joan Hunt, do you disagree in any way that that is the approved process that is in place now?
It's my understanding that these contracts, or at least one of these contracts, was done in a slightly different way. It wasn't brought to the BESE president leadership prior to being approved.
So every other contract that we've approved, and that's now before us, has been approved in a different manner than one other contract.
I've not reviewed all of those contracts, but that's my understanding.
Okay, let me back up and ask you the question that I asked though. In terms of the process that's established, that's in place, that we follow, is that the right process? Do you have any disagreement with that process?
I think at this point, I'm going to have to defer to the auditor that they've been called in to address this issue, and I think they're going to be the ones who have to answer that question at this point, now that it's been raised to them.
All right, so let me ask both of you, both Ms. Hunt and you, Mr. Rongo, is there any reason as our counsel for the department, and you as counsel for us, that any one of these contracts that have been presented, that you believe that as attorneys, you would advise us not to approve in any way? Let me start with Ms. Hunt. What about you?
I would not advise that you not approve them. I would advise that you do approve them.
You advise that we approve them because you believe that the process has been followed both internally by the department, and that is the correct process to be followed?
Yes, that's correct.
So, Mr. Rongo, do you believe that the process that has been established by the department, is that the legal process? Is there anything wrong with the process that's been established?
My advice would be to wait for the outcome of the investigation that I understand is currently ongoing. And there would not be a prohibition from you all moving forward with the contract. However, there would be concern that about you all voting on a contract or approving contracts that is under investigation.
Okay, so all of these contracts, let's start with the $4 million contract from Coastal Wade and Netherville, and all of these other contracts. Are you concerned in any way about the process, and have you looked into those in any way?
Not that contract specifically.
Are there any other contracts that are here presented to us today that you looked at that you would advise us not to approve?
It's my understanding that those that were not brought to the BESE leadership prior to payment would be initiated.
Have there been any contracts that have been not brought to the BESE leadership?
None of them have.
Okay, so Ms. Davis, thanks for piping up. So, Ms. Davis, are you saying that none of these contracts have been brought to BESE leadership for approval?
No, sir. Oh, well, one, but it hasn't been approved.
So, you're saying that we have been presented with a fair number of contracts that we have approved that had not been brought to the BESE leadership?
Correct.
Can you identify what?
I have a list of
Yeah.
all of those noted as emergencies.
Yeah.
You all approved after the fact, but you weren't notified. I don't know, maybe I should. In
No.
advance that they had already been issued and some paid on.
I see.
And you approved after the fact. And then the Invicta was being, they brought it up, but the Invicta actually received a payment on the 2 days after they asked Ms. Holloway to approve the contract.
So now I'm concerned, because these 40 contracts, or the 40 contracts that we approved, and you're saying that the process wasn't followed with respect to those 40. So Ms. Davis, you are executive director. When did you learn that we weren't following the right process?
I learned 2 weeks ago, there were some contracts in June that came to you that were being put forth as received on through our meeting process of preparation. They were being put forth as received, and some of them were over 50,000. So I asked Mr. Mall, why are these received and not approved? Because they're over 50. At that time, Ms. Hunt was brought in, and Ms. Hunt said they should be ratified, not received. I said, why are they ratified? I have the email to this effect. Why are they ratified if the department doesn't have the authority to issue them to begin with? We are the ones that have a separate authority, separate from procurement, 17.6, where BESE approves all LDE contracts. Why weren't they brought to the BESE president if they were emergencies? If you're using that procurement waiver, then they should then go to Ms. Holloway, and if she approves them, then the board can ratify it. But why are we ratifying something to that effect? Ms. Hunt argued that the procurement statute authorized them to do that. So I said, I'm not going to make this legal decision. Please put an executive recommendation together that speaks to that effect, that these were issued in that manner, and change the motion to ratify. And I have consulted with, I highlighted this to Dr. Bromley and to the BESE leadership on our check-in call that I did not think that this was the correct way to go about this. Please don't do this again. Subsequently, in August, there was another contract that came forth as an emergency, not as a ratify, but as an approved. It had already been issued. So when I received a public records request for a contract that was issued by the department in March and didn't get approved by the board until April, that's when I noticed that there was 40 contracts that had been issued on this emergency basis but had not been approved by Ms. Holloway prior to issuance. So that's when, so I'm sorry I had to go so long into that, but I was aware of some in June, but I did not know to the extent, and it wasn't until I got a public records request from a totally different contractor, a private person, a person requesting a totally different contract. That's when I called and said up to Ms. Mold, what's going on here? Where are these contracts coming from? And she said, don't you remember we talked about this in June? I said, yeah, we talked about it in June. I said, it wasn't right, and you need to ratify these. And so then she said on that phone call, well, we have this other contract that I need to give Ms. Holloway to approve, and that's when I found out about it. So 2 weeks ago, about approximately 3 weeks ago.
So this really isn't about Victor at all.
No,
It really is about this entire process, and that is your contention that this board has been approving contracts and ratifying contracts in a manner that you don't think is consistent with the established process.
Yes, sir.
And we've been doing that. This entire board has been led to approve these contracts for several months now because of a process that you believe is somehow flawed. Is that right, Ms. Davis? I can't hear you.
Yes, sir.
So, I know we spent a lot of time, and Mrs. Centel's here, wrote an article about Dr. Rutledge and raised lots of concerns. Was Dr. Rutledge consulted in any way about the process that we follow internally as a BESE board or the Department of Education?
I don't know, no, she wasn't, and I don't know why we would contact a contractor.
Yeah, which is probably the case, that contractors really don't get involved in our internal process, how we conduct business internally. So she wouldn't know, nor would Postal Wade and Netherville or any one of these contractors, what our internal process is. Is that right?
That's right.
So Mr. Reinbold, it sounds like the concern is a broader one. So when you bring into the equation the legislative auditor, and Dr. Timmel, your points were well taken. That is, the legislative auditor has been asked to come in by the department, as well as BESE, to look at our internal control process, whether we have a good procedure and whether we're following those procedures. And that's the part, Mr. Reinbold, that you're referring to, that we need to allow that process to determine whether all we've been doing for the last 6 months, whether that's correct or not, as a department and as a board of elementary and secondary education. Is that right, folks?
That's correct.
All right, so now I'm terribly concerned then, because we're now being asked again today to vote on contracts that our executive director just said that the process is flawed in some way and it is broken. So I would suspect that our executive director would suggest to us that perhaps we don't approve any of these contracts because the process is one that is flawed, and you don't recommend, as our executive director, that we approve any of these contracts with this process. Is that right, Ms. Davis?
I don't recommend the emergency contracts. The emergent contract, I don't think is an emergency contract, but the other two, you said, there was another one that you said was an emergency.
Yeah, well, there are lots of them that are being approved on an emergency basis, and that goes back to some questions I asked this morning. So we just heard, and I'm not sure where our $4 billion gatekeeper is, but when we asked about this money, that we've got $4 billion to allocate on an emergency basis to help students in the state of Louisiana, that we've been facing some pretty significant time deadlines. The September 30th deadlines for LEAs to get their plans in, a December 31st deadline to get that approved. And on top of that, we run the risk of not only not providing services to students and to districts, we also run the risk as a state of forfeiting the very good fortune of the money that we receive. So I have what one might call a dilemma, and that is if we don't approve these, and we've had folks working on an emergency basis because they've relied upon us as a department and as a Board of Elementary and Secondary Education to start doing work in our behalf and have done work. If we take your advice, our legal counsel's advice, and our executive director's advice, and don't approve them, does the work stop? What happens to all of these plans? What happens to the students and the school districts all around the state? Because we have learned that we have a flawed process that frankly has nothing to do with any of these contractors in any way, because it sounds like our advisors sitting before us are saying that we may, at best, have an internally flawed process that has nothing to do with these contractors that we have engaged to perform services on our behalf. So at some point, I'd like for someone to help me resolve this dilemma of what appears to be our own broken process that we've been complicit in as a board because we've all voted to approve it. And how do we solve the problem that these very well-meaning people in good faith have engaged us in our services? So, and I'm not sure at this point, Madam Lady, who is the appropriate person to help guide us out of this still no. Because there are lots of things that are at stake here. And I just sort of open that up to anyone that might be able to offer us collectively some advice in terms of how do we work our way out of this very public problem.
I just want to say, I don't think the process is, I don't personally think the process is flawed. I just think it wasn't followed. That's, I don't know, it's just what you're saying.
Okay, I think Mr. Garvey may wish to try to shed a little light on this. Mr. Garvey?
Yeah, well, I'd like to try and get some shed. I don't think I'm going to shed it, but the question is for Mr. Rondu, our Assistant Attorney General. I tried to separate these contracts into two groups. One group being a group that we did not have problems with, and the other being a group that we did have problems with. I heard you say something and I wanted to get clarity on it. Did you say that all of these contracts have problems and that you would recommend that we defer on all of these contracts in this agenda item?
If the procedure wasn't followed, then yes, but to the extent that the procedure was followed differently for these three contracts versus the ones that they were pulled from, then I would have a question.
And Ms. Davis, was the procedure followed, or was it, let's phrase it this way, was the procedure not followed on all of these contracts, or are there some of these contracts where the procedure was followed as far as you knew the procedure to be?
I'm not aware about the one emergency contract, what's,
Postal waiver?
yes, I'm not aware if that contract has actually been issued and paid upon yet. If so, if it's been issued, then under the procurement, then you need to ratify that contract. I mean, well, no, you don't need to ratify, I'm sorry. If it's been issued and paid, then yes, there's a problem with it. The Invicta has been issued and paid, and that is why it's being investigated. And so that's the only one that I'm aware of those three that was issued and paid prior to board approval.
And what about the remaining contracts, other than the three that you just mentioned? Do you know of any problems with them?
No.
So between what you're saying and what our AAG is saying, y'all would not recommend that we defer on the other contracts that are on the table right now, or that are in the motion that's in front of us right now?
I mean, again, I haven't looked at all of these contracts, but I stand by what I said before.
But according to
If
what
they
Ms.
suffer-
Davis is saying, it fits your criteria of being ready for approval with no objections from you. If she says the procedure was followed.
If that's correct, then I would have no issue with y'all.
Okay, so the ones that are in the motion right now, from what I'm hearing, there's no problem with moving forward. I guess I'm stating that to the BESE members, so you heard what I heard.
Well, I think we started to talk about the ones other than these three.
Correct.
And then we're seemingly focusing in a little bit on these three.
I was trying to avoid.
Okay. Mr. Castillo, go ahead.
I need some assurance, because if I'm going to vote again, and I just heard Ms. Davis saying that we've had 40 contracts that we've never approved in the past and now, and no one seems to know with certainty what procedural posture these other contracts that are in, that I appreciate Mr. Garvey's attempt to separate them out. But I need some level of confidence that someone's not going to come back and say, Preston Castile, Jim Garvey, all of us have somehow violated the process because we're being told that things that we may have done in the past, that wasn't right. And someone needs to tell me what we did in the past was right and what we're about to do now is correct before we vote on these contracts.
And just reacting to that a little bit too, if we're talking about 40 contracts that we have let out since this proclamation has been in effect, and we're just now hearing within the last couple of weeks that that procedure may not have been the way it should have been, it really gives me pause to see what kind of internal, I guess, controls that we have. with the department and then moving over to BESE and then being presented with them. Because it would seem to me, if the reason we're saying that they may not have followed procedure is that these 40 were not presented to the board president to sign prior to, then why were they on our agenda to approve in the first place? Because the first time that we, the rest of us, have ever heard about any of this was in the last few weeks. So what we've done, and it's really more than 6 months, it's quite a while since this has been in effect. I'm not even sure which 40 contracts we're even talking about at that point. Regular contracts, let me ask you this question. Emergency contracts aside, regular contracts that are presented to us for approval, are those contracts signed by the BESE president after we approve them?
Yes, ma'am.
Even though the start date on some of these contracts are well in advance?
Yes, ma'am.
And I'll be honest, when I first got on BESE about 6 years ago, it has been the practice of BESE all these years, and I think those who have been on here longer than I, we have always approved contracts, because I questioned it. We approved contracts, and I'll look at a start date of a contract, which is before the date we approved it. And I said, well, why would we be approving a contract after an initial start date? So, well, that's the way we do it, it follows procedures, et cetera, et cetera. So when we get a contract up here and we look at it, a start date prior to the day that we get it is not unusual. That's been the case the whole 6 years I've been on this board, and I was told by those who preceded me, it's been that way for quite a long period of time. So if the board president doesn't sign the regular contract till after we approve it, then we're back, I guess, to these 40 contracts that have been let out. And if you're telling me, are you telling me then that none of the 40 were signed by the board president prior to it coming to BESE?
So I checked with procurement because with those contracts that came in June, I said, I'm just going to let these come to the board because surely when it gets to procurement and there's no signature of the board president, then payment will not be made. So I thought it would get caught at that point. So if there was a question, legal question about it. So I contacted the procurement office. Once I got this other contract that was issued in March, not related to Invicta, and I saw that it was signed by Dr. Brumley in March, or Ms. Mosley, I can't, and then there was no signature on the contract at all from Ms. Holloway, and I thought, how did this get through? And so I questioned them, and they said, if a contract is submitted on an emergency basis with a cover letter stating that it was an emergency contract under the governor's proclamation, then we don't look at anything else. We don't look at anything else for signature in the contract. So that is why I was very concerned, because then I went back and I pulled all, and not about our process, I pulled all the contracts that were approved by the board and designated as an emergency, and I then began to pull when it was issued and when it was paid upon, and there were several that were done that way. So then I thought, well, what could there be some we don't know about that didn't ever make it to the board, just got lost in the cracks? And so that's why this legislative audit was extremely important, and not one that your regular internal audit would find, because it's different, because they're only going to go through certain paperwork for that. This is a different process to look at a bigger scope of things. So that is.
So what we're saying is state procurement felt everything was in line. They looked at the executive order, they looked at the emergency. So in terms of the state, Office of State Procurement, they felt everything was in line. What you're saying is it may violate some internal procedure we have.
What it violates is the other, which they're not looking for, the statute that requires BESE to approve it, not related to procurement, is where the missing piece is. So for procurement and payment, you need this piece of information, which is the governor's proclamation. But for ultimate approval is a separate thing, which requires Ms. Holloway or the board to approve it, which should come prior to execution of the contract.
Go ahead, Mr. Castillo.
So I'm deeply concerned again, because we have publicly implied that individuals, broadly and specifically, may have misappropriated funds. And there was some intent to do things that, frankly, in recitation of statutes, that they may have even committed crimes. I struggle sitting here today when I listen to the fact that we don't know our own process. We don't know whether we follow the process, that we may have besmirched someone's character and integrity, either broadly the department or individuals in some way, that is troubling to me, that we are here today, and that is the posture of the circumstances around all this, when there is, I'll say kindly, a lack of clarity about what our process is and what we did or didn't do jointly as a board of elementary and secondary education and the Department of Education. That just simply troubles me if that is our posture. But maybe everybody else on this board has a lot more clarity and understands this more clearly than I do. With me, frankly, I'm just a little bit confused, and I don't think I'm alone.
Well, so, Dr. Davis?
I just want to make sure that I have an understanding of this, because when I think about this, it appears to me that the Invictus contract is really, the problem with it is an accident of timing. That for all 40 of the contracts that we approved under the emergency declaration, that if we had continued down the road that we have been, right, so if we approved those contracts in June, if they had been paid upon prior to that, right, or if they had been paid upon prior to the June meeting, they would all be in the same state that Invictus is in. Is that correct?
I don't think you were aware. My understanding is that they had awarded or essentially advised the individuals that they were going to issue the contract. They might have even executed it. But I don't think it was the board's understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the contract had been paid upon, because all those other contracts, besides the ones in June, weren't even presented to you as already have been issued. They were presented to you as an approval. And I don't think you were aware that it could even be a possibility that it was paid like you are for this one.
I guess my point is that Invictus has come to light because we did not meet and approve it in a routine manner, just like we have with all of these other emergency contracts before the check went out.
But that wasn't the routine manner. The
But
routine
there's the
manner.
manner of how
Yeah.
we have been handling this since the emergency.
Unknowingly.
Well, but that's what, but does that make sense? That this, right, that this is just, if this is just a matter of timing, that we would have treated Invictus the exact same way as any of these other contracts and approved it. It just so happened that a check was cut prior to when BESE met. I guess, is that my point? Like, we would not, it's possible that the other contracts could have been paid upon before BESE met, and we just happened to meet the week before their checks went out, right? Because our process would not have caught any of the others, correct?
I think we have a process problem, and it extends even prior to June or when this administration came on. I'm sure this was happening in March, this was happening before that, under a former administration. I think we have a process issue here. Mr. Farman?
Yes, I think the person who can help us answer these questions is the auditor. I would suggest that we stop discussing it and let the auditor tell us what we need to change going forward. And so I'd suggest that we move forward. If Mr. Preston has concerns about the group of contracts that are on the table, maybe we can ask Ms. Davis to get with Mr. Lingbu to go over what she thinks, why she thinks the group that's on the table right now is proper to be moved forward, and see if he agrees, and then we can address that tomorrow. And we can get this motion off the table, and then we can address the other three, which, for what it's worth, I'm planning to move that we defer until the auditor has his chance to tell us what he has seen in his audit.
If your motion eventually would be to defer, do we stop all work on this contract?
The three, I would say yes.
Even though we have to get plans approved?
The three that are, I think the plans can be approved without these three contracts going forward.
One of the contracts
Is to evaluate,
is to evaluate and recommend the approval of the plans that are supposed to be done by December 31st.
we are, let me back up, we're supposed to approve plans by December 31st? I don't think we're supposed to approve
No,
them.
well, I don't know if that is a federal deadline or if that is one that we have said to the schools or what.
It is a deadline it is a deadline that we've communicated to the schools, but also federally, being that they are asking, and as a part of our federal requirements, when will our LEA plans be live and posted? And we have communicated that by the end of December, those plans will be live and posted, our LEA plans.
And what about the non-public schools with the postal weight metal bill contract amendment? That will stop all work on theirs as well?
Yes.
I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead,
that
Mr.
question.
Garvey.
Well, yeah, if we do not, if these plans do not get posted by January 31st, as you just described,
December.
December 31st, will we lose federal funding or will we not lose federal funding?
I don't think it's a question of losing federal funding. I think it's a question of owning the commitment that we made to the federal government regarding our processes and what we communicated in our plans.
Okay, but my question is, will we lose federal funding?
That's not been communicated to us, the
So,
status of,
as far as you know, we will not lose federal
as
funding.
far as I know.
Okay, so I think waiting, and January, I think, is when the auditor is rumored to be ready to bring something back to us, which is our next meeting. So
I
I
would just
don't think
say,
that delaying till January doesn't sound like it would cause a problem.
If I could just address that in meeting
Go
with
ahead.
the auditor, I'm sorry, on yesterday. They did not commit a timeline, but it did seem as if it could be extended beyond January because of the holidays. And so that was just, I asked for next steps, I asked for a timeline, and so that is what was communicated to me.
Well, Ms. Davis, can we get the auditor to come in tomorrow to talk to us about
He
this?
expressed this, I did speak with him, just to get an estimate, and he said that, his work would be finished, but it would then have to go to legal within the auditor's office. So he thought it was highly unlikely that it would be ready for January.
Well, do you think he would come tomorrow
I
and
don't know
talk to
that
us?
he would say that, I don't know if he would
Okay,
say.
for
Maybe he would
purposes-
come and tell us he can't say that.
No, I don't think he could.
All right, Mr. Garvey, for purposes of today, let's just reframe this. Other than these three contracts right now, does anyone have a problem, or legal, have a problem with us moving forward with the regular contracts that are not on an emergency basis? But Mr. Garvey's original motion, let's start there. Do we have a problem with that?
Just to confirm,
Confirm.
are there any other contracts that are before us that are being considered on an emergency basis?
Dr. Timmel, do you know if there are any other contracts you presented that are on an emergency basis other than those two we just named today? Well, the third one, emergent, is an emergency. I don't know why we're both of things.
Right,
That
and
was a
P&M
request.
was an amendment, so I
Right,
think
to an original one, was the original one an emergency?
the original one was
So-
emergency.
I would tend to lump it into there. But I'm talking about the ones other than the three we're suggesting to pull for the moment. The other contracts, or any of these others issued on an emergency basis?
No.
No. So, any other, just then, the original contracts, any other questions concerning those, other than the three that we pulled? Mr. Morris?
Thank you, Superintendent Bochet. As I understand the conversation, there's a concern about the controls practice that's in place, whether or not we have control of the process and whether or not we understand it, as Mr. Castillo laid out. But then the other conversation is about going forward. I'd like to understand why. First of all, I'd like to understand, is there anything in any of these contracts that anybody does not approve of?
That what?
That were the services that we're purchasing? Is there anything in there that we would not approve? Content of the contract, is there anything within the content of the contract that anybody in this room would not approve? Are we happy with these services? Are they good for our children? Why is that a difficult question? I don't know.
Who are you?
Haven't they been reviewed by the staff and recommended for approval?
Superintendent maybe could answer that again.
There's a review process, so I guess I'm asking the department. The department has a review process in the base case for any contract. Somebody's gone in, read the contract, understood it satisfies a legitimate business need, and we need to purchase these services, we have the funds to do so, then we follow the process. Somebody reviewed it and approved the contract. So my question is there anything in any of these contracts that we would not approve? They've already been reviewed. Is there anything in there, Superintendent Bromley, that your folks have reviewed that if you had to do it again, you do not think these are in the best interest of our children and we do not need these services?
I mean, this is ongoing work that has already begun, and I think our team is satisfied with the quality of work that we receive.
Okay, so this is a good thing for our kids, and we need to purchase these services for our kids. I think we can get aligned on that. So that's going forward. The auditor's going to take care of what happened in the past, right? So my concern is there any reason why this board would not approve the content of these contracts? If there's no reason why we shouldn't approve it, can somebody tell me what is the approval process today to approve these contracts? The full board is here. We've got department recommendation to approve the contracts. Take everything in the past that went wrong and recommend let's go forward from today. We have all the people in the room right now to approve the contracts so that these children can benefit from these services. Can somebody speak to the process? Can we do this today? Can this board vote to approve these contracts?
Well, that's a good question. And I'm not, well, to
Well, maybe
me,
I can phrase it
we're
another
looking
way.
at a process.
Could I phrase it another way?
Yeah.
What's at risk if we do approve it today? I don't hear any risk.
May I say something?
Yes, ma'am.
In an email that Ms. Shan Davis sent to Dr. Jamal, in an email that Ms. Shan Davis sent to Dr. Jamal and myself and some other folks on June 4th, 2021, she says, I think the proclamation allowed the contracts to be issued. So we're good there. But that is separate and apart from the requirement of BESE to ultimately approve, in my opinion. And so according to the direction we got from the executive director of BESE, we were fine issuing the contracts under the proclamations and then bringing them to BESE for approval. This was back in June that we were told this.
Okay, so do we need a motion, asking a question, do we need a motion before this board to approve these contracts? Can we do that? Okay, and so the answer is yes, okay? So again, when I ask, what's the worst case scenario, we approve these contracts today? From a legal perspective, what's the worst case scenario for what could happen if we approve these contracts today? Is there a legal concern if we approve these contracts today?
Are we asking that of our board?
I'm asking the two attorneys that are advising this board and then Mark.
Well, again, in accordance with what we got from the executive director of BESE, we followed the process. We issued the contracts under the proclamation, and then they're being brought to BESE for approval. So I don't see any downside from that. We're doing what the executive
So
director
I hear no
does.
risk from this table. From this table, I'm asking, is there a risk here from a legal perspective? This board approves these contracts today.
I think y'all are aware of the potential issues with the process, but I think it is within y'all's prerogative to ratify what, well, I think ratify.
When I said issue in the email, I meant procure. You know, we want, I didn't mean like.
So what's the
So what is
worst
your-
case scenario? What's the worst case scenario?
I think the one that's just an amendment, my opinion is fine, because you already have a contract in place. It's just an amendment to the contract. So I
Well,
think that one
if
is
we
fine.
issued an emergency contract against regulations and against procedure way back, and now we're gonna amend from what you
No,
say,
but that one
a
was.
contract that was not
Oh, was
issued
that one an
correctly. Yes,
emergency?
that was an emergency contract.
That was one, oh.
Could our legal counsel answer Mr. Morris's question,
I
please?
can't point to any specific sanction or anything like that that would come to the board if you all choose within your discretion, knowing the concerns about the process that wasn't followed. If y'all are comfortable with the merits of the contract and moving forward with that, then I think y'all are able to proceed.
Okay, thank you, sir. So I'll make a motion that the board approves the contract.
Oh, wait. Let's take care, first of all, of the ones that are not in question right now, because we have that motion on the floor, and then Mr. Morris, you can make this motion, okay?
Thank you.
All right, so let's take a look, the motion that is currently on the floor to approve all contracts other than the three that we pulled, which were Emergent, Invicta, and Postal Wait and Natterville. We have a motion, we have a second to the motion.
No, Mr. Morris and Mr. Rock made the first motion to approve the contracts in the beginning.
Okay,
Then Mr.
Mr. Garvey made a substitute motion to pull three and to approve all the rest. Seconded, I think it was Ms. Mellering who seconded. That's the motion on the floor.
Gotcha.
All right, so that's the motion on the floor. Any other questions concerning Mr. Garvey's motion? Any objections?
You have a recusal.
Any objections to Mr. Garvey's motion? Dr. Davis, you have a recusal?
I need to recuse myself on item 5.4, the LSU contracts.
Okay, any other? Okay, then any objections to this motion? Hearing none, motion passes. Now, Mr. Morris, now we're going to address the three that were pulled. Mr. Morris, do you have a motion?
So just to be clear where we are right now, are we trying to approve all of these contracts, or are we speaking to one specific group or the other, just the three?
Actually, two of these three have some connection to the emergency process. Invicta and Postal Wait and Natterville. Ms. Garvey also pulled Emergent. I'm not sure, I guess that's a discussion of a different nature because it's not an emergency contract. So let's take the two that are the emergency contracts first, and then we'll have to get to that third. Because they don't have anything in common unless you wish to group them together in whatever motion you're making.
Well, what I heard was that none of the legal counsel in the room has taken any exception to this board approving all of the contracts because they've all been recommended for implementation by the State Department of Education. So I don't understand, I don't personally understand any reason why this board would not want these services to be provided to our children in a timely manner. And if that's the case, I see no reason if this board has the authority to legally authorize these contracts today, we would not authorize all of these contracts today so that they can be executed in a timely manner for the benefit of our children. So my motion is that we approve all these contracts today for the benefit of our children in a timely manner.
All three?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, is there a second to that motion?
I second it.
All right, Mr. Rock seconds. Let's have discussion.
Public comments too.
Well, I
Sorry,
know.
I just want to remind you.
Board discussion, I have public comment right here. Mr. Carter?
Yes, the motion includes a contract that's being reviewed by the auditor, and I don't think it's a good idea for us to approve a contract that's being reviewed by the auditor until we hear that from him. So I'll be voting against the motion.
Okay. Any other questions or statements at this point before I allow public comment? We can still question after that. Okay, let me just ask a question before our attorney, our advisor, leaves the table. To Mr. Morris's question about the downside of this, let me flip that over. We have two of these contracts under this emergency criteria. One, a new contract, one, an amendment to an existing emergency contract. Work has been done on both. One, we know there has been a payment made. My assumption is the other one, since it was a very large contract, there have been payments made, I would assume. What is the downside? What happens if it was determined we violated our process, but that, for example, the State Office of Procurement went ahead and felt everything was fine to issue payment under the guidelines that were set up for payment? It seems to me the issue that we're grappling with is, did we violate our process to approve these contracts? And my understanding of what this discussion has been is that y'all are saying the process was, if it was an emergency contract, it should have gone to the board president for her signature and approval, and then sent to BESE for approval. So we supposedly skipped the process of sending it to the board president. But there's nothing, to my knowledge, other than that step being skipped, that's being questioned in terms of violating the process. The work has been done, the scope and sequence set out, we procured it properly, the payment was made in accordance with the rules from the Office of State Procurement. So I thought we were asking the legislative auditor to review our processes. We obviously have a problem with the process, because if the process, in my opinion, was in place that the emergency contract should have gone to the BESE president to be signed prior to coming to the board for approval, then we have an internal control process. Because why didn't that step happen, and why didn't it get caught before somebody put it on our agenda? So in other words, if it didn't go to the board president, how did it even get on our agenda? So I think we have an internal control process here. And to me, that's an internal weakness. That is not anything having to do with misappropriation of funds. It doesn't have anything to do with anything other than that. I think we have maybe some weak internal controls, and then possibly a difference of opinion on what the emergency declaration allowed us to do. Could it go straight up to state procurement, or did we have to follow that? So I think that needs to be sorted out so that we know in the future the correct process that has to happen. But, Mr. Morris's thing in terms of, I think both of these contracts are issued in a good way to the non-public schools. It's a very large contract, for oversight of those funds going in that direction. This $120,000 contract to review the plans, And I think work's been done on both of these things. So I don't know how you not pay somebody when the work is done. I don't know what legal exposure we would have in that regard. That these two people or two entities that we contracted with in good faith, issued them a contract, whether we followed our internal processes or not, sent it to state procurement and they were paid. What do? We go back and ask for the money back? So I'm not sure how to proceed with it. But having said all that before, I didn't mean to make those comments before I got a public comment, but I guess what I'm trying to ask you, that I think both Mr. Castillo and Mr. Morris are trying to, what do we do now? We let out two contracts, signed it, had the people do the work for it, sent it to state procurement, they paid it. And if we violated our internal processes, how do we fix it? Do we now say, as Mr. Morris is suggesting, take the rest of the contract, split it up, and say, okay, BESE board, do we approve then the other half of this contract? Do we approve the amendment to the first contract for Postal Wait and Netterville separately and approve their amendment? Now, since we have all 11 of us here, could we think about that? I'd rather think about it tonight from a legal perspective and give us some advice on how to proceed. Because I don't think anybody has done anything intentionally wrong anywhere. And I am just a little bit upset from running my own district and going through my own financial and compliance audits. The internal controls of an organization are extremely important. And I think we're lacking internal controls of what happened between the department and BESE. Because how we got this far in the process, I have no idea. And that's where I think the legislative auditor can help us to review that process and to suggest how to strengthen those internal controls. But then in the interim, what do we do with the work already done that we promised these two vendors we would pay them? Madam Chairman? Madam Chairwoman? So I'm asking the...
And I think it comes down to what's required is for BESE to approve these contracts. Like I said before, y'all have everything in front of you at this point. Y'all are aware of potential contracts not going through that process the right way, but y'all are aware of that now. Y'all know what these contracts are, what they're for, what may or may not have happened. So I think it is within y'all's discretion to approve these contracts as they're before you now with all that information in front of you.
So you think we could approve it given the information if we feel it's a valuable contract? Okay, Ms. Howard? I'm sorry, Ms. Jones.
I just was calling a question. I think we've had a very lengthy discussion about it.
Okay, but we need to get a public comment first, okay? So I have, thank you all very much. Mr. Gray Sexton from Instructional supports the recommendation, which is this week.
Good afternoon. I'm Gray Sexton. My partner Alicia Artland and I are here on behalf of Invicta and Dr. Rose. We're not familiar.
Your microphone's not on.
Is the green light on, Mr. Sexton?
We're not familiar with, as Davis has described as the process. We are familiar with the Louisiana Procurement Code. We are familiar with the Division of Administration's regulations concerning the letting of public contracts. And we are absolutely certain that these contracts were let in accordance with the provisions of the Louisiana Procurement Code and in accordance with the provisions of the Division of Administration's procurement process. In the case of our particular client here, the work has been performed in large measure. About 70% of this emergency work has been performed. The contract calls for 2 payments. One of those payments has been made. The second payment is due on December 31st. I do know that services were sought by the department from our client who provided these services on an emergency basis in good faith in accordance with the contract documents and that the payment schedule is outlined in the contract documents, and the first of those two payments has indeed been made. And I would appeal to you to recognize that my clients are entitled to have the contract payments made. They seek to complete the services under this emergency contract. It is of significance for the welfare of the state's students. No one has suggested otherwise. No one has suggested that the people providing these services are not more than qualified for the provision of the services, or that there's any impediment to the approval of the contract, or the ratification of the contract, or perhaps a better choice of words, other than what might be described as a process with the BESE board that has not been followed. Again, we know nothing about that, and would respectfully appeal to you to honor the BESE board and the department's contractual obligations to our client. If you have any questions, or if there are any concerns, we would like to address and resolve those concerns.
Thank you. Next request, Ms. Romer, Calvin Romer. And Ms. Barrios, if you would just move to the front because you're up next.
Good afternoon, Caroline Romer, Louisiana Association of Public Charter Schools. 2 points. First one, just in general. Hope you can move forward on your processes and get that all situated. But we agree that most likely these contracts, if had been presented appropriately, would have been contracts that everyone would have agreed to, we believe. But bottom line is, these are dollars that are needed in classrooms and for children. And so please just keep your process moving forward as quickly as you can so those dollars can be freed up to be used for the benefit of children. I originally was planning, though, to speak on the emergent contract. That's the $68,500 contract. I'm going to talk about it because we're confused from, and I'll speak specifically from LAPCS, why this isn't an entity that is operating under open meeting laws. And I just use this contract as an example that you're spending almost $70,000 to facilitate some type of work group that, again, is not operating under open meeting laws. That is not the advice that LAPCS gives to our charter boards. We very much believe that governance should be done in a transparent and open way. And so we tell our membership when they form working groups, subcommittees, task force, whatever you want to call it, it is doing the business of the school. And so it should be done in a way that public may not have to fall under necessarily where public comment is taken, but that public can be present and hear the conversation. So again, just questioning a work group of some BESE members, hiring an outside entity. It looks like, it says here, to support the development of a final report capturing the work, findings, and recommendations of the work group. To me, that reads, this is going to impact policy, and therefore it should fall under open meeting law. So I have had lovely conversations with folks inside BESE and others to get clarity on this, but I would request that BESE get some clarity around what should be applied as far as open meeting laws and not only this work group, but any moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, I would ask the superintendent.
Yeah, just don't disagree with Ms. Romer on that particular issue. I want to separate two issues in that conversation. The first is an emergent contract, and second is rather the BESE work group should meet in public forum. I am not responsible for the second half of that question, but I do want to speak to the emergent contract. When the group, the BESE work group, was created, part of that recommendation said that the department would provide a facilitator for that work because it is a heavy lift to help coordinate meetings and all the logistical work, do stakeholder interviews because we think that touch points with all the various stakeholder groups is most important. And so the contract that we have with Emergent is for hours worked And so that dollar amount is they do not exceed dollar amount. And at this point, I believe they've worked about a little over 20 hours. And that equates to a little over, I think, $3,000 for work already performed. But I just want to say that those are two different issues. I think the contract versus whether or not BESE decides to handle that work group in public forum. It's not working.
Okay, Ms. Barrios?
Lee Barrios, retired teacher from St. Tammany. I believe there's more than one, I see more than one elephant in this room. The elephant that you've been discussing primarily is the legality and the procedure. And I concur with Ms. Boyche's experience and mine for the last 11 years participating as a citizen at BESE, that this procedure of letting a contract prior to BESE approving it, and sometimes even after it was fully paid out, has been a practice that has gone on way too much in the previous administration, and the majority of BESE members would approve it. And it was questioned, and it didn't go anywhere. There are examples of one glaring to me of a service contract being let for $49,995. I mean, how obvious can you get? Another elephant is transparency, just an aside. I think the word transparency is thrown around a lot, but you don't call your mother from Las Vegas and tell her that you just got married. That's not transparency after the fact. And I think transparency is very important. It certainly is to the citizens. Another elephant is possible conflicts of interest. And this is information that I only know from articles that were written in the paper. And it's just questionable whenever you have closest former associates who worked in a public school system working so closely and being so much a part of that contract process. And I won't go into that because I'm sure you know it. And I'm not questioning the intent, it's the perception. And sometimes perception is reality. Another elephant is capability. I don't know the Invicta people. I know what I read in the newspaper, and I know that this was a company that was formed, I think, 2 weeks prior to they received the contract. Correct me if I'm incorrect. And I'll be through in just a second, Ms. Boyche. The question of, well, what could happen? We approve the contract, it's a good contract for good services. Well, if you hire a contractor to build a bridge and you find out halfway through or at any point that he wasn't capable and he's having mistakes, the contract was still good, the specs were still good, so what do you do? We had a case in St. Tammany where the school board had to fire a contractor for artificial football fields. In the case of a construction contract, they're bonded out. So what happens there when they were fired is the bonding company takes over and they either hire another contract. There's a whole lot of accountability going on in this state of education. And matter of fact, I think too much of what the department does at BESE has to do with accountability, measuring things. And I just feel like at this point, it's been acknowledged, it's been seen what's been happening for the last 10 or 11 years, that somebody needs to be held accountable for this, no matter how good the contract is. Thank you.
Okay, that wraps up the public comment. We have a motion on the floor by Mr. Morris to approve the 3 contracts, on a second by Mr. Rock. Do we have further discussion from board members?
I just want to clarify that if we don't pass these contracts today and the work stops, and the auditor, who in all likelihood is not going to be finished for our January meeting, and we don't meet in February, that means no work will be done in these parochial schools or non-public schools, and then there will be no work done on the remaining contracts. Right, until March, because we don't meet again until March, or in the January meeting.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Morris?
Yeah, just also want to comment on the audit itself. My understanding, at least what I've heard today, is that the focus of the audit is on the work process. It's not on the content of the contract itself or the services that are provided. What I've heard today is that the services that have been provided are consistent with expectations and they've met the timeline. So I'm not aware of any concern for the services that are being provided. So we consider the motion, I think our focus here is on the services that are provided, not whether or not the previous work process was followed. What we would be working on here, the new work process, to accomplish the same thing.
And just to comment, I do feel better about it, that, I know that, I think the review will ask the auditors to take a look at our process, which really has nothing to do with the content of these contracts. I feel much better after speaking with our counsel, who's indicated if we have all of us here, we know what the deliverables are in the contract. We feel that it is valuable, that it does feel comfortable with us proceeding, knowing that all 11 of us are here if we agree to that. So, thank you for that. Any other comments before we vote? All right, we have a motion, we have a second. Any objection to the motion? Mr. Garvey?
Yes, for a roll call.
All right, I'll do a roll call vote.
Dr. Bopey is not in attendance. Mr. Castile?
I recuse as to all three contracts.
Dr. Davis?
Yes.
Mr. Ellis? Miss Ellis, I'm sorry. No. No? Nay? Nay. Mr. Garvey said nay. All right. Ms. Holloway?
Nay.
Mr. Bellarine?
Nay.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Ms. Orange Jones?
Nay.
Mr. Rock?
Yes.
You want to vote, Ms. Winfrey?
Yes.
You saying yes? 3 yes, 4 yeses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 nays, and a recuse. Motion failed.
Okay, motion fails, so none of those contracts are approved. At this point, then I think we are going to need some legal advice on how we proceed if we stop work on all of these. So I would ask that possibly tomorrow morning our counsel could advise us on how we would proceed since we have denied all 3 of these contracts. Okay, next item, please.
On page 109, item 5.5, consideration of federal and state grants and allocations to LEAs, Type 2 charters, Type 5 charters, approved non-public schools, and community-based organizations, edited formula and other. Recommendation is to approve.
I need a motion. Moved by Ms. Jones. Ms. Jones, I need a second. Mr. Morris, any questions or comments?
This is super negotiating. I just want to acknowledge here that we are pushing, is this 5.5?
Yes.
Okay, I'll hold my commentary.
Any questions? I know we have a few refusals. I have these. Ms. Ellis, you have a refusal?
On ESER 2 of them and 3.
All right, any other? All right, any objections to the motion other than those refusals? Hearing none, motion passes.
Superintendent Gaucher, just want to acknowledge to the board allocations here are significant, millions of dollars of allocations from our 10% of our state agency set aside that we are pushing out into school systems. So of course we know that 90% of dollars from the stimulus money go directly to systems, but we have tried our best to utilize the 10% and push that out when appropriate. And so what you have accomplished today is distributing additional resources to schools so that they can complete the work of their academic recovery and acceleration plans. Some of those areas where we have key investments that have been funded include early childhood education, hosting electronically for IGPs in high schools, ninth grade academies, SPED certification for people who would like to receive SPED certification, working to help them certify because it's a critical need area, and then class certification for certification in early childhood. So of the 10% of funds that we have as a state agency, we are pushing more of that out into school systems, and those are just a few of the areas where you have pushed that out to help them complete their academic recovery and acceleration plan.
Thank you, Superintendent. Next item, please.
On page 135, item 5.6, consideration of an update report on Louisiana Department of Education progress toward meeting key performance indicators for ESSER investments. Recommendation is to receive the report.
Need a motion to receive. Mr. Morris, Dr. Davis, seconds.
Yes, Danielle Mitchell, the Department of Education. I believe updated packets should have been provided with updated data and numbers as of this morning. So there should have been.
You have these handouts.
Great. Thank you all once again. Today we're going to go through our key performance indicators, most of which were reviewed at our prior BESE meeting. So once again, the key performance indicators that we're looking at are those areas where we are investing and our LEAs are investing in the highest impact initiatives for the state's set-aside portion. So again, our commitments to our stakeholders is number one, that our investments have a collective impact. Number two, that our planning is outcomes and strategic and priorities based. And third, that we are transparent and accountable for how these funds are used. So here is a high-level summary of those investments, some of which Dr. Brumley just spoke about. A couple of just caveats here. As our school systems are actually applying for funds, the amounts that we actually budgeted may fluctuate depending on how they are requesting those funds. So for example, let's say that we put $10 million aside for a certain initiative like ninth grade academy. If only $5 million of that was requested by our school systems, then we would then reallocate that $5 million to another one of the key initiatives. That's why you see some of those numbers fluctuating slightly in between meetings, but they've remained overall steady throughout the priorities. So now we're going to go through each priority and look at the key performance indicators for some of the work that we are calling out as being elevated for work that we are laser focused on. So for priority one, we are going to look today at the student engagement and attendance key performance indicators. So engaging our students and ensuring attendance to make sure that they are at school ready to learn is a top priority of this administration. And there are three objectives by which we are measuring our impact, or three objectives that we are striving for in key performance indicators that will help us know how we are progressing, but also measuring our impact. So the first is to increase our cohort graduation rate. And the key performance indicator there obviously is the graduation rate. And as of the most recent data, we are at 84%. The national average is 88%. And so our delta there is 4%. That is our target that we are striving to reach for. And the CCR team is working to achieve that. The second objective here is to increase the re-enrollment of our 16,000 students who were no longer engaged following the pandemic. So we are looking at our attendance in February of 2020, the attendance of our students in October 2020, and we see that that delta is 16,791.
And the third objective is to decrease the number of students who are chronically absent or tardy. We have multiple performance indicators to help us get a holistic, collective picture of achieving this objective to decrease those numbers. So first is the student attendance rates. The second one is chronic absenteeism, and this one we are really laser focused on because there is not only a national definition or a national norm that we can compare to, but this looks at all the absences or any reason that a student would not be in school, excused or unexcused, whether it's for a school affiliated event or not. So we know if a kid isn't in the classroom, they aren't learning. The third one is out of school suspension, and then the fourth is truancy. So while we do believe that chronic absenteeism is the most useful data point, we also know that truancy is something that we do report, so we are including that. We believe that having multiple data points is necessary to ensure that our objectives, but also the way that we're monitoring our progress, is not only valid but reliable and allows us to make the necessary decisions to get the best outcomes for our students. So what you see here are highlights of investments that we are making with these dollars specific to supporting the achievement of those objectives as measured by the key performance indicators. So some of the key initiatives being invested here are a child welfare and attendance position. That amount that you see is for not only salary and benefits, but for 3 years. Again, we are providing an allocation opportunity to our school systems for dropout early warning systems. And you see there the partnership with LSU Alliance. And then fourth, one of our allocations that's going out today with your approval is the 9th grade academy. For priority 2, the work that we are elevating are 2 things. First is expanding high-quality early childhood seats, and secondly is student well-being and behavioral health. So the first one, expanding high-quality seats, we have 2 main objectives that we are looking at to measure our performance here. The first is around access, so that is the quantity. And looking at the number of children, especially those birth through 3 years old, who are accessing high-quality seats. We know by looking at our data and from the Early Childhood Commission that we are doing a pretty good job with our 4-year-olds, especially those who are economically disadvantaged. More than 90% are accessing quality programs. But we really see major gaps with our birth through 3-year-olds. And so you see those performance indicators as the points of data that we have chosen to improve on this objective. Second is the quality. So we are looking at specifically the instruments that we use to measure the quality of our early childhood programs. And that is going to be looking at the percentage of sites with a performance rating of proficient or higher, but also the average score for instructional support domain for pre-K and the average score for engaged support for learning domain for our younger children. And those are components of the overall score, but really speak to the quality of instruction happening. The key investments that we're making for those performance indicators are, first, early childhood seats match. So this is an opportunity for our school systems to put up their own money and then request additional match funding to expand the number of seats available. And then second is the class certification, being able to increase the number of people who are certified, and the class pilot. The second body of work being elevated for priority 2 is around our student well-being and behavioral health. The first objective is to ensure all students can access certified professionals to provide mental and behavioral health services. And we have 2 important key performance indicators here. The first one is the number of social workers. So we have a partnership in a social worker expansion grant with LSU to really highlight this work and put in some sustainable and also like systematic structures to build a stronger pipeline of our social workers graduating from preparation programs and getting them into our schools. The second key performance indicator here is around the percent of covered services provided as indicated on what's called the random moment time study. So this is actually something that goes out at random to our Medicaid service providers. And they will select through a list of what the activity is that they are doing at that moment. And that percentage of the times that those individuals indicate they are actually providing a quote-unquote billable service actually also directly correlates to our Medicaid reimbursement rates. So this is a really important data point that we are working to not only build our sustainability and our capacity here at the agency, but also helping to train our local school systems on maximizing the services that they can provide for their students. The second objective is around decreasing schools exhibiting persistent and excessive out-of-school discipline as defined by approximately twice the national average. This is in direct alignment with how we identify our schools per our ESSA plan. And so those three indicators there reflect that. And just a caveat here, you will see coming soon on a lot of these targets, that is because a lot of this work is new work. We are undergoing it right now, and we also have individuals newly at the helm leading this work. So giving them an opportunity to really dive deep into this data, get with other partners internally but also externally to make sure that they are setting the right targets. So some of the investments supporting that work are, number one, being able to do a match for our school systems as they are providing those mental and behavioral health services. Second is the social worker expansion. And then third is a job appointment specific to helping to support our school-based Medicaid. And again, that position is for 3 years. The third priority, highest quality teaching and learning, we are looking at two key work areas. First is academic recovery and acceleration, and that encompasses all of those sub-bullets that you see listed there. And then the second area of work that we will look at is literacy. So first, for the academic recovery and acceleration, the objective is quite simply to increase the percentage of students who were most impacted by the pandemic, scoring mastery or above on the assessments. There are numerous ways that not only we at the state, but our school systems are looking at identifying and determining who their students are that are quote-unquote most impacted. You can look academically, mentally, behaviorally, many different ways. We are choosing to be laser focused here on the academic portion, which is why you see the key performance indicators laser focused on the statewide assessments. The key investments for that is, first of all, the Accelerating Schools allocation that went to, before you all at the last BESE meeting, before and after school programming, summer learning experiences, the Accelerate tutoring program, tutoring vouchers, and measuring student learning loss and progress. The second body of work that we are looking at for priority 3 is literacy. Our objective is to increase the percentage of students who are reading on or above grade level by the end of 3rd grade. So we have 4 main key performance indicators associated with this objective. The first one, Dr. Chasson shared in an earlier BESE meeting, some goals that she has set for us as an agency to improve upon our performance with our 3rd graders, in particular, reading at or above grade level. So right now, based on our NAEP results, we are at 25.7%. She has outlined a trajectory for us to be at about 34% by 2027. This would put us at or above the national average. The second 2 performance indicators associated with this are around the statewide assessment performance. And then the third is around our literacy screeners. I believe next month you all will be getting an update regarding the performance on the literacy screeners for students this year. That data is not included yet. Targets will be set once that data is available.
We have a key investment here around literacy screeners. I just want to point out that multiple investments across priorities would obviously help to support those key performance indicators that we just went through for literacy, but specifically calling out literacy screeners, we have an RFP process underway to identify a single screener. The next priority is our educator workforce, and here we're going to highlight literacy foundations, professional development, and regional literacy coordinators. So for the first one, literacy professional learning, our objective is that each teacher and school administrator who serves students in kindergarten through 3rd grade successfully complete a foundational literacy skills instruction course. This also aligns with policy or legislation that was passed this past session. So simply put, we are looking at the total number of teachers in those grades, and that is our target. Our school systems have had an extension with submitting data, which is why we don't have those actual numbers here. We will in January. Some key investments to support this work are the Literacy Foundations Professional Development, the Literacy Foundations Professional Development Program that we here are building, and then the Regional Literacy Coordinators. The last priority is our system structures and partnerships. And the 3 areas that we're going to highlight today are the priorities-based strategic planning and budgeting, school improvement, which would encompass those sub-bullets, as well as educator recruitment and retention. So the first one, school improvement, as you heard earlier from our Deputy Assistant Superintendent of School Improvement, she and her team are working very diligently at not only kind of equipping themselves to serve a different role than what our previous network coaches served, but also setting goals to make sure that they are moving the needle for the students in these schools. And secondly, that we are increasing high quality schools and for our students and families, and that work is going to be seen in our Reimagined School Systems Initiative. The 2 investments that support these are, number 1, the school improvement best practices, giving funds to our school systems to access that training, and then secondly, the Reimagined School Systems Initiative that school systems are actually actively applying for now, and we will be bringing that all to you in a later BESE meeting for approval. The second body of work under Priority 5 is priorities-based strategic planning and budgeting. And our objective here is to support our school systems with building multi-year priorities-based strategic plans and budgets. And we have 2 key performance indicators. First, the number of our school systems that have approved academic recovery and acceleration plans. Second, the number of LEAs participating in the Strong School Systems pilot. If you recall, that was an initiative where we had a few superintendents come and talk about the positive impact of participating in that initiative, particularly around the strategic mapping, planning, and budgeting. The investment here is $6 million to support the Strong School Systems work. And the last body of work that we wanted to highlight, even though we know that this work is very new and has a task force dedicated to putting forth recommendations to different bodies around how we can increase the retention and the recruitment and retention of our educators here in Louisiana. So we are leaving this as to be determined because that task force is actively working on putting out those recommendations, and I believe Dr. Kim Hunter-Reed will be providing some of that information tomorrow, and M. Cooper will be providing some of that information in January. So as we continue to report and bring this information back to BESE, you all should see those objectives and key performance indicators included. Some of the key investments that we're making in this area are first around a recruitment retention campaign. This has, it will include some of the recommendations that come out of the task force. And then secondly, our new teacher supports. And this is providing mentors for all of our new teachers who are in the classroom for the first time. So again, those are our commitments to you all, but also to our students, our families, and our communities. And our next steps are to continue to update as data is available and as the work evolves. Secondly, to implement internal reviews and progress monitor to inform our decisions. And then third is to provide quarterly updates to this body, to BESE, so that you all are abreast of our progress. That concludes the presentation.
Any questions? Mr. Morris?
I just want to say thank you for the work. It was extremely valuable. It's an enormous amount of federal funding. We need to be accountable for, transparent, and so forth. So I really appreciate the work, and particularly the aggressive targets that I've seen on the ones where you have identified what your target is. So I appreciate the aggressive targets. And I think we'll hear from you again with an update in March. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? All right, we have a motion to receive and a second. Any objections to the motion? Hearing none, motion passes. Next item, please.
On page 205, item 6.2, consideration of HE funding cycle activities, approval of HE statewide programs for fiscal year 2021-2022. Recommendation is to approve.
Need a motion? Ms. Orange-Jones, seconded by Mr. Rock. Any questions concerning the recommendation? All right. Any objections to the motion? Hearing none, motion passes. Next item, please.
On page 214, item 6.3, consideration of HE funding cycle activities, building the HE annual program and budget for fiscal year 2022-2023. Recommendation is to approve.
May I have a motion, please? Mr. Rock moves, a second. Mr. Morris seconds the motion. Any questions concerning the 22-23 drafted budget? Okay, any objections to the motion? Hearing none, motion passes. Next item.
On page 219, item 8.1, consideration of legislative reports. Recommendations are to approve the reports in response to HCR 11 and 18 of the 2021 regular session and receive the report in response to Act 236 of the 2019 regular session.
First, I need a motion to approve 1 and 2 and receive 3. Would someone offer that? Mr. Morris, second by Ms. Holloway. Superintendent, do you have anything to propose? Any questions then concerning these legislative reports? Okay, any objection to the motion? Hearing no, motion passes. Next item.
On page 282, item 8.2, consideration of the 2021 BESE annual report regarding educator certification, revocations, and record reviews. The recommendation is to approve the report and authorize the BESE executive director to submit the report, including the results of the record reviews conducted at the December meeting, to the House and Senate Education Committees at December 31st, 2021.
May I have a motion, please? Mr. Rock, and a second. Dr. Davis, any questions concerning the report? Are there any objections to the motion? Hearing none, motion passes.
That concludes your agenda.
Okay.